Hey everyone, welcome back to No Talking Points, iPolitics signature podcast. I'm your co-host, Mark Vigliotti, editor-in-chief of iPolitics. I'm joined as always by Brian Storseth, our publisher. And our special guest today is Sarah Hamilton, a principal with Wellington Dupont. She joins us from beautiful and snowy Alberta, which is something here in Ottawa we're also grappling with because spring is never, ever going to come. But one thing we know for sure is happening is next Monday we have a slate of important by-elections that could push the Liberals from a minority to a majority positioning. I feel like we've spoken ad nauseum about the by-elections and the importance of the race. But one thing I think we haven't talked too much about is what next? What if the Liberals, as many expect, move to majority after these by-elections? And is now the time, if that happens, does that mean the Prime Minister needs to reset things, needs to have a cabinet shuffle, make some big moves in Parliament? He said he's not thinking of proroguing, but what would you do if you were advising the Prime Minister what happens once you get to 172 and potentially 173 in that?
Well, I think that it is a significant number to get to. Obviously, there's obviously the potential for more floor crossers, but I don't think all of the political pundits in Ottawa would love to see the big things, the cabinet shuffle, the floor crossings, the proroguing. But really, if I'm the government, I want to keep things steady as she goes for this session. You've got important legislation in front of Parliament that you don't want to reset. And you got things in front of the Senate that you don't want to reset. We'll talk about that later. So yeah, I think you got to get through the spring session with the same makeup. There is a potential for a cabinet shuffle, but I don't think you want to prorogue things and reset everything in Parliament until probably the fall. It would make more sense to prorogue in the fall and push to get everything you can through Parliament here this spring.
And Sarah, you're obviously very, very familiar with political happenings. What's your read? Do you agree with Brian that now is not the time, that even if you got to 173, that maybe you delay any big changes into the fall, have a nice little reset, or do you got to act when the iron's hot?
I think summer is always a great time for a cabinet shuffle. You're a year in, you have maybe a complement of a few more members of Parliament, maybe a little bit of rebalancing of the table, and it's a good time to recalibrate before you go into budget in the fall. So I wouldn't rule that out. I think that there's been some chatter about elections. I think that most people have dismissed that, but I agree with Brian that it makes more sense to prorogue in the fall, just given the stakes right now. I also wonder if the opposition parties in their current state could perhaps give a little bit of ground to some of the demands that may come forward, for instance, on committees. They may be more willing to talk rather than to completely upset the order of government right now and risk their own positions. I think this government has shown the tendency to be serious. So there's a little less, Brian may laugh at this, a little less political gamesmanship, and yet a little bit less political gamesmanship. And I think it's getting someplace with some of the opposition parties right now.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. Like at the end of the day, what's the need for a resetting of the committee structure when opposition's not getting in your way right now? Like the Conservatives are in the middle of a rebranding of their leader. The NDP they just elected their leader and they want him to get his footing underneath them. So I don't see a lot of resistance in Parliament. I don't see a lot of real need there. The last December, October, November, December of the Trudeau government, as you recall, nothing was moving. Everything was getting grinded in committees. There was filibusters. There was things getting voted down. That's just not the situation right now. And so I don't see the need for it happening right away. Every government prorogues at some point. And once they get some of their stuff done, it seems like it would make sense to do at some point in time, but I think right now is not the time. I agree with Sarah.
I do wonder too, Brian. You bring up the point of when you're at that position of power, and you're able to, run roughshod through the opposition. Thank God you have the Premier of Ontario basically saying, "I hope the Liberals get their majority." You run the risk of, if you make a move like reorienting committees, if you provoke a fight from someone. You talk about the Conservatives. It's another rebranding effort. I feel like we're on the rebranding effort number 3 right now. It's like, what do you have to gain if you're Mark Carney, from making any moves that will, piss off the opposition, but at the same time, or do you just keep pounding them while they're at their weakest point? Do you call that election because no one knows who Avi Lewis is? Do you, ram the committee structure through because Pierre Poilievre is still licking his wounds and they're trailing, 15 or 20 points in the polls? I'm just very curious from both of you, from people who've been in this game, what do you do? Do you kick them while they're down, or do you just walk away because you don't want to potentially, fire them up and give them something to rally you?
Sarah, I'll let you go first.
It kind of leads into convention. Nobody really likes it when the Liberals are arrogant, in my opinion. And I think that maybe the charisma of Mark Carney across Canada right now is that he hasn't been too pleased with himself. And he hasn't taken himself too seriously, but he also is taking the job seriously. And I think that resonates with a lot of voters, especially in Western Canada. I also think, and going back a couple weeks to Pierre Poilievre's appearance on Joe Rogan, a functioning right now of the Conservatives as being the official opposition in Canada, but Poilievre and Carney being very sort of having that one Canada message when they go abroad and when they're talking to foreign media, foreign governments, etc. So as much as I think it's tempting to start the political gamesmanship that you're talking about, I think that's also something that really soured a lot of people on the Trudeau government. And I think that's been a differentiator in this Prime Minister's office. And my political advice would be to caution against that kind of one-upsmanship. As much as it's so much a part of politics, I don't know that Canadians are in the mood for it right now. And I think it has benefited Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, exceptionally well over the last year. I don't know how much people have really digested that sort of Ottawa insider gamesmanship that we saw maybe come out of the Conservative campaign last year. Didn't sit well with a lot of Canadians who feel that Canada is in an existential crisis right now, and still do, if we're going to talk about polling later. Still do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I tend to think that Canadians elected this Prime Minister and this government to get things done. They are kind of have a mandate already to get things done. Going to an election really is counterintuitive to all of that. I mean, would be seen, I believe, as a very selfish reason to go to an election. And then I think also from the Prime Minister's point of view, you gain a year, right? They're only a year into the mandate. You gain 1 year by going to an election now. There is obviously risk in allowing Pierre to continue to evolve. Avi Lewis, nobody really knows. We had Erin on last week. She had some great points on the potential of Avi Lewis, whether that'll be seen and fulfilled. I mean, so I think there's risk to the Liberals in waiting a couple of years for an election or not going this year. But the reality is, at the end of the day, when you get elected because you have things you want to get done. Carney's not got those things done yet. So I think he's going to want an opportunity to try to get those things done. And that's why they're putting so much effort into floor crossers and kind of manufacturing a majority government. 172 is far from a real majority for anybody that's been there. There will always be somebody that is sick, somebody that retires. You need a 3-4 seat majority to have a real functioning majority.
Well, and sorry, Marco. I said I would anticipate that Avi Lewis doesn't have a seat in the House currently. So I would anticipate that there's going to be another resignation there on the New Democrat side to allow Avi Lewis the opportunity to run.
There's not many to resign, though.
Which could be a really fascinating conversation about where that seat's going to come from. Does it come from the Lower Mainland? Does it come from the single seat in Alberta, which is a bit of a New Democrat stronghold, or does it come from Ontario? So,
but I have a question for you, Sarah. Sorry to interrupt, but you're sitting in right beside that seat right now. Would Avi Lewis win a by-election in Heather McPherson's seat?
Ooh, that's a party versus personality question. I wouldn't say no. I just don't think it would be wise for them to run here, because I can pull a bunch of tape from the last week in the Alberta legislature, and the United Conservatives are having a absolute field day with the footage that came out of the New Democrat convention in Winnipeg. I think he could win here. I just think if the New Democrats are trying to rebuild and they want to rebuild with the help of the Alberta New Democrats running in Alberta, ironically, is not actually the best move. But I also, I don't know what's ahead for Heather McPherson. How does she sort of carry forward sitting in the caucus behind a party and a leader that is at odds with so much of what she and the Alberta New Democrats have been talking about for the last 10 years?
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly a long ways from anything Rachel Notley would have ever supported, right? The Abby Lewis platform.
Absolutely. And yet, so if we're talking about what Canada looks like going into the next election, from an Alberta perspective, I don't know that I would say pretty confidently Avi Lewis is not forming the next government. But from a domestic policy perspective, he is going to, I think, pull on issues that have been left behind by both the Liberals and the Conservatives, especially that fight for the working class. Although I think the Conservatives did a good job in the last election and continue to do a really good job on the fighting for the working families and working class. I also think the climate issue has been left behind. If we go to the polling question later, like there's a lot of people who feel as much as Trump is an existential issue to Canada, so is climate. And that is polling remarkably low compared to what the American question is polling.
I mean, we can make that leap right now. I mean, because I think it ties into this conversation. If you're the liberal brain trust, to Brian's points, like, you got elected to do things, and it's only been a year. I mean, it hasn't even been a year since the last election. What do you point to take the voters? But at the same time, you look at where the polling is right now. You've opened up a massive lead that has to be tempting. I understand. But at the same time, if that happens and you go to the polls, let's say the polls come true and the Liberals win a big majority, that means Pierre Poilievre's out as leader. That may prompt a rethinking or will prompt a mandatory leadership review of Avi Lewis. You might have an entirely new set of players. Do you look at the landscape right now and think, if I'm Mark Carney, I have someone in Avi Lewis who is polarizing, who may prove us wrong. I don't think most Canadians know who he is, who may be able to light a fire under the NDP, but that seems not at all proven. You have Pierre Poilievre, who's someone who just lost the last election, whose personal popularity is not as strong as Mark Carney. Why inject uncertainty by having an election, and that may potentially reshuffle your dance partners? Do you not like who you're dealing with right now if you're Mark Carney? And I know that may sound like a super arrogant thing to say, but do you like who you're facing off with? Do you like this matchup?
I think you bring up a really good point, which is that if you get through the next election and the Conservatives don't prevail with a majority of seats, it triggers a mandatory leadership review. I think we have seen. I think we have seen that. To your point, they have good collaborators right now. I probably shouldn't phrase it that way, but they can work with this opposition. Even I think Avi Lewis, they'll be able to work with. As soon as you start switching it up, I would say with some confidence that the Conservatives would probably move further to the right. I don't know what Brian thinks about it, but I don't see them coming back at Mark Carney with somebody more moderate. I see somebody a little bit more strident and right-leaning. And I think if you're watching what's happening in Alberta right now, that's giving some folks the heebie-jeebies in terms of what that means for the sort of existential issues pressing Canada right now. I will forever, every time we talk about an early election, I will forever go back to the 2015 Alberta election in which Jim Prentice, who was a great premier, albeit short tenured one, called an early election only a year out from the sort of mandatory election day, and subsequently 44 years of the Progressive Conservative government ended. As a bit of a rebuke, I think, of that early election call. I think so I'm always cautious about making the grab for 4 more years and assuming that the electorate won't mind. That I will always be cautious about that. I think that the Prime Minister has built a very difficult coalition here, but I don't know that it's been to his detriment. They're trying to do really big things, and the longer that they're able to stay in power during at least this sort of parliament, the more they can entrench some of the big moves that they've been trying to make across the country.
Yeah, and I would just add that you have now two opposition leaders that invigorate their bases, right? I think it's safe to say with both Pierre and Abby, it's yet to be seen whether, Pierre's trying to move back towards somewhat of a ground to take some more seats in the GTA. I wouldn't say that's a traditional right or left move with some of the stuff, some of the media he's been doing and some of the podcasts he's been doing, but they certainly invigorate their base, and that leaves a big swath of room for the Prime Minister. I think the risk for the Prime Minister whenever he goes to the polls, and it will be the Liberals that decide when the next election is does he get the things that he's talking about? Like, he threw his hat over the wall, and these are not easy things that he's said that he's going to do. And I think part of the risk going to an election a year in at this point in time is the Liberals haven't accomplished anything. There's a lot of great press bites, there's a lot of great speeches, but they've not actually built major projects. They've not actually moved. The country's economies continue to go down. I mean, tough with the U.S. president being in the position that he is, counter to Canada. It makes it, I understand it's headwater, but at the end of the day, the Liberals haven't accomplished anything right now either. So I think I think the three main parties, the NDP, the Liberals, and the Conservatives, all feel like it's in their best interest to continue to move this Parliament forward in somewhat of a productive manner. The Bloc are the sole ones that kind of sit there and are looking at it saying, I think we can pick up seats right now. But they're not trying to be government anyways. So I think you're going to have more of the same for the next year at least.
And a little bit, looking at the polling that came out last week, Abacus still has cost of living as the number one issue in Canada. And that's something I think the Liberals are, number two, I should say, Trump and his administration. Number three is the economy. I think the Liberals have shown some command of the question of Trump and his administration, as well as the economy. I think the cost of living question is still owned by the Conservatives. And as soon as you go back to the polls or start testing the water on that, I think it gives the Conservatives a really big platform to demonstrate that knowledge on and how attractive they have been to voters on that issue.
Well, I do wonder though, Brian, do you need to have, to Sarah's point, do you need to have like something to take to the voters if you do call an early election? Because if it's just, we're doing great work, keep us in power, to Sarah's point, so living is one of the, if not the top issue for a lot of voters. And I don't know if you can point to anything to say, oh, well, prices have fallen in certain markets. Like I know there's some weakness in our housing market and you're starting to see it reflect, but I think most people would still say housing's too expensive. Like, do you need something to take to them like they had last April, which was choose me because I can deal with Trump? You need something like that because on an issue like affordability, it's not quite clear what the narrative is.
Well, yeah. And then remember, at the beginning of this Parliament there, a couple months ago, they were McKinnon, the House leader, was trying to position it as, well, the Conservatives are being obstructive and we can't get anything done. And if we can't get a mandate done, then we're going to go to an election. And then immediately as the polls start coming out and you see Liberals rising up in places like Alberta and other places, it's like the Conservatives all of a sudden are not resisting things for the most part in Parliament, except for a couple of bills that they think are obviously very beneficial politically to them. So I don't know what the mandate would be at this point in time. You've not accomplished the things that you said you wanted to accomplish. You're not getting obstruction. Looks like you could have a majority Parliament. Like, there really isn't a reason for it. And I go back to like the Prime Minister's banker by trade, risk, ROI. What's the return going into an election 1 year out? Even if you're going to win, you gain an extra year mandate. You spend tens of millions of dollars and you impair everything. All of the things you're currently trying to do, all of the major projects, everything gets thrown into uncertainty for 30, 60 days of an election cycle. Plus you need to put your government back together. Like, these things don't happen quickly. And there is still a chance you could end up with no more seats than what, like, remember, they very well could be come next week at 172, 174 seats. If there's floor crossers that we're seeing out there, there's no guarantee you're going to have a majority government. So at the end of the day, I think there's more risk than there is return on this for the Prime Minister.
That's a good point, Brian, because, like we're saying, we're a year out from an election. So if you call one now, that 4-year, let's say you had a majority in last April, that becomes a 5-year time window as opposed to a 4. Like, doesn't seem like there's much to gain. I did want to talk a bit about the upcoming Liberal convention. As Brian knows, one of the great political rivalries in Canada is the Liberals versus themselves, or Liberals versus the Liberals.
Those are my favorite rivalries.
Yeah, as a conservative, no doubt.
Where's Chrétien and Martin these days?
That's what I mean. Like, I feel like we're going into a Liberal convention where everything is looking good for them. Last time they were in Ottawa in 2023, the question was, will Trudeau run again? And I think it was just the start of the waves of bad polling. Still, it seemed like at that time, compared to where things got, it seemed like a bit of a high point. But there are still questions of, is this still the right guy to go into another election? Now, I don't think we're going into this convention in Montreal later this week. And I don't know if there's any real big questions they need to grapple with. Some of the policy resolutions that got some questions were, efforts to maybe constrain use of notwithstanding clause. Again, policy resolutions don't really matter that much in terms of the leader can choose to ignore them, which I don't know if Mark Carney's really going to take advice from the Liberal, grassroots on really any decision. So, like I said, Brian, you're a big fan of the liberal infighting. It doesn't seem like we have any right now. Can that be sustained for any period of time? This level of congeniality and the era of good feelings in the Liberal Party.
Person asked that one too. Sarah.
So I think that the most dangerous thing actually that can happen to a party is to have a lot of people who are self-satisfied and don't have anything to do. Looking at this convention could be Mark Carney's victory lap. He had a great success this year. He had a great success in Davos. There's been a rash of floor crossings. They're on the verge of becoming a majority government. And I think that I mentioned earlier, there's nothing that creates distaste for the Liberals more than Liberal self-satisfaction, especially sort of in Western Canada. I think the Liberals learned a long time ago that you keep policy votes off the main floor. I think probably less than the New Democrats would be well advised to look into in future years, although then I don't know what they'd be talking about at their conventions. So I think that there's a risk that if the Liberals go into this weekend doing that victory lap, especially the Prime Minister, they'll look out of touch, they'll look arrogant. And I think that it's time to double down on that humanity and humility that I think is making this particular Prime Minister popular with people. That seriousness. I think that it's also an opportunity to signal that kind of organizational and governance prowess that I think people associate with the Prime Minister. There was some chatter a year ago that as they were doing that transition between the two, the Trudeau government and the Carney government, there was a lot of centralization. It's probably time for the next step, which is empowering the ministers and the staff around you that have capacity to start to enact some of these big changes. I think they've been doing that a little bit, but I think this could signal that sort of second chapter of their government. I also think that the risk is that they don't keep the big tent open. I think that they've attracted a lot of progressive conservatives to this government to the detriment of the actual conservatives. But I also think that there are some changes that happened in the Trudeau era that are starting to get lost to time, especially issues on climate, for instance. If we're going to talk about some of the legislative changes that happen, it's a little inside baseball, but that's what we're here for. You risk losing the center left of the party if you are sticky, if you're not sort of at least maintaining some of the significant reforms that early Trudeau government brought in.
I mean, no real elections for officers and no policies presented. Isn't that just the perfect Liberal convention? I mean, but in seriousness, Sarah brings up a good issue. It baffles me and continues to baffle me how Carney's going to keep the environmental groups inside the Liberal voting coalition, because at the end of the day, I've never seen a prime minister be able to keep increase his standing in the oil patch in Alberta while at the same time maintain the level of environmental voters that Trudeau had, right? So, which leads me to a question once we get to on more on the polling is that number in Alberta real? There's subsequent polling that seems to show that it is, but it's baffling how people that are driven by policy and the Conservative Party is filled with these people. Certainly, I think, Marco, the Trudeau Liberals were filled with policy first people as well. And they seem to have stuck, at least in the last election, with the Liberals. They didn't go to the NDP. and Carney was able to gain 60 and over voters from the Conservatives. That's a tough coalition to keep together. And usually policy conventions are a place where you can reinvigorate some of those policy first voters.
That's a good point, Brian. I do wonder, though, does it become a bit of an easier coalition to hold together when the NDP is polling, or is it in such a, dire straits right now? Like, is it, do you, if you're a Liberal voter, if you're a Liberal organizer, do you think, I don't like what Carney's doing on the environment, but I'd rather be with a team that's in a position to make changes as opposed to sitting on the sidelines and criticizing? Like, is that maybe Mark Carney's secret tool for keeping caucus unity? Like, what are you going to do? What do you, we're kind of the only game in town, unless you want to go to a party who seems to be even more vigorously supportive of oil and gas.
Yeah, I asked the question. I don't understand how he's able to hold it together.
Well, Sarah, I want to. Sorry, go ahead.
That to me is the opportunity for Avi Lewis. If I'm sitting in his office, which I would almost never be invited to, but if I were his strategist, I'd be looking at where the Liberals were letting people down. They did attract a coalition of, I would say, dark orange voters from 2015 onwards, that people who felt that the environment and climate question was significant enough to vote Liberal, maybe for the first or second time in their life. And I think that they built a really strong base based on that. And I think that's why they came out of the gates so strong in 2015 on climate issues, because they knew that that's where they had won the election, and that it was time. I think also the zeitgeist of the time was climate aware and climate friendly. I think that's shifted pretty significantly over the last 10 years, especially since the pandemic. But I would absolutely, if I were on Avi Lewis's team, be looking to the places where the Liberals made promises and are now perhaps going back on that. In the same way, I'm looking at that on the Conservative side. Who's fighting for the middle class? Who's fighting for cost of living and affordability? Who's fighting who's fighting for climate and the environment? Who's fighting for human rights? Like all of these things. And I think the Liberals have left a really big opening for the New Democrats to answer some of those questions.
Yeah, I do wonder, you brings up a good point. I want to shift the gear to polling. You speak about Alberta, and it seems as the more the Liberals are, signal that openness to oil and gas, there comes that risk on the left flank in terms of losing environmental voters. You're in Alberta. Brian alluded to it. Poll after poll shows that Liberals are making some pretty significant gains from where they were in 2025. Is this going to translate to enough seats that could compensate for potentially losing a few seats to the NDP and, the lower mainland in BC and potentially places like central Toronto? Is there enough there for the Liberals to pick up in Edmonton and Calgary, or, is this polling maybe not going to translate to any big seat pickups for the government?
I think it can't be understated how much Alberta has changed, and the demographics of Alberta continue to change. Alberta's calling campaign attracted a lot of folks from central Canada and eastern Canada because of the promise of housing affordability and job availability. It's led to a remarkable amount of growth, especially, I'd say, in the last 4 years here. And with that come different voting patterns, particularly in urban ridings. That combined with the redistricting, of course, we saw Edmonton Riverbend elected a Conservative MP who subsequently crossed the floor. I checked last night as to whether or not that had shifted anything in the riding. It's projected 83%, I think, to go to the Liberals. I looked next door to Edmonton West, which is an area I represented where I grew up. That is also projected that's liberal leaning in the next election. Of course, as you both know, there's a lot of time that can pass, and that can easily switch back. And it looked a lot different, I would say, obviously a year or so ago. But the demographics are shifting. I also want to remind you, Alberta was a progressive conservative province for 44 years. And so it tends to lean to that balance, like that balanced economy instinct, if you will. And although the United Conservatives have been in government for 2 terms now, I still think a lot of those progressive conservative notions hold true here, and the sensibility holds true. So think, like, I could wax poetic about Alberta, but I also think that Alberta is being pretty far away from Ottawa and sort of the daily goings on of the federal government. It really depends on who the prime minister is here. I would say that's kind of a truism in federal politics outside of Ontario generally, but I think that the prime minister laying claim to Alberta, not being afraid to be from here, holds some sway in the minds of voters here. I mean, I don't see I don't see this province going totally red anytime soon, Brian. So I think they're safe. But I think your urban ridings, absolutely. I think you're going to see the Liberals come a lot closer than they have recently, especially with high education. I'm very curious what happens in Edmonton Strathcona, which is the sole seat held by the New Democrats right now, as to whether or not the Liberals start to place higher. It was kind of I'm going to say a two-horse race there historically, but if it becomes a bit more split, which would, of course, lead us back to the early 2000s, and you could have a potential conservative upset in that seat again.
Now, of course, though, Sarah, we would have to overlay all of this with the Carney curse on the Oilers, right? Like they are on their way to the Stanley Cup to win it, and then he goes and skates with them, and things just start falling apart. But in seriousness, Marco, Sarah was an elected city councillor, a very popular elected city councillor in Edmonton, won her seat when one of those rare times when the tide is turning against the current council. So I take seriously your comments when it comes to like on the ground in Edmonton and especially the west part of the city there. What has always surprised me, and maybe you could help me on this, Sarah, like the Liberals have never really pulled this high in the city, but like it's like the NDP have been able to capture those left of center voters in Edmonton, and the Liberals haven't been able to. Do you think that can change this time around? And do the Liberals have the ground game to, like, because we both know there's a difference between polling well and having the ground game to be able to bring those voters out, right? Like, do they have the ground game that can bring those, first identify and then bring those voters out?
That is the question. So to go back in the beginning part of your question, and I didn't have time to disaggregate some of the polls from last week, but oftentimes it's modeled like nationally you're polling this. If we rebalance the tables this way, then we could project that maybe you're polling this in this specific city or province. I think that there's a little bit more specificity to these polls, but they were small number polls. So I think that's worth noting. Capacity for the political parties has been, especially the center and left of center parties, has been a really big issue in Edmonton and Alberta. I think both provincially and federally. Provincially, New Democrat nominations are largely uncontested, even for sitting MLAs. And federally, they are also the Liberal and New Democrat nominations tend to go uncontested, unless, of course, you're in something like Edmonton Centre or a riding where there has been shown some viability. But still, I'm actually trying to think of a contested federal Liberal nomination here in the last 10 years, especially one that was heavily contested. Why I bring that up is because that often is the proving ground for your organizational capacity. So have both parties inhibited their organizing capacity by limiting or not having super competitive nomination processes? Conservative nominations, as you know, can be actually more competitive than the election. And they actually, in many cases, they are more competitive than the election. And you often have to put a lot of personal capital up to win a nomination because you can't get a donation the same way that you can in a general election once you're the nominated candidate. So the Liberals have quietly built up some organizing capacity in the Edmonton, Calgary region. I think that they probably have a long way to go to be able to pull out those voters in a federal election where it could make a really significant difference.
I'm just curious, it was last in Alberta back in 2023 for the provincial election. And there are pockets of Calgary. I briefly lived there when I was starting my career. And there are pockets of Calgary that were deep suburbia. And I went door knocking with NDP. And there was a lot of warm, feelings, a lot of positive vibes for the message they were selling. And a few of those really deep suburban ridings in Calgary flipped and started having me thinking of, is it the Liberal brand that's toxic? That if, they, were selling a different message, had a different leader, they'd be able to maybe have a fairer fight in some of these deep suburbs of Calgary that have long seen as conservative strongholds. It seems like Mark Carney is certainly bucking that trend. So even if they don't have that, capacity, that kind of, local organizing ability, on the flip side, the NDP infrastructure there doesn't seem like Nahinishi's going to be hanging out with Avi Lewis anytime. Is that really a big a factor, or do you just, as the only real progressive alternative, and if Mark Carney loses that liberal kind of curse, does it become that much easier for the Liberals to simply become the only viable alternative for someone who doesn't want to vote Conservative?
Federally or provincially?
Federally.
Federally. Yeah, especially in a place like Calgary. I would say.
Would you argue that's what the NDP is doing provincially? It's not necessarily like everyone is suddenly a social democrat in Alberta. It's just, this is a progressive party, and if I don't want to vote UCP, there's no real provincial Liberal party. The NDP seems like a tolerable bunch.
I would agree with that. I think that they really struggle with that federal tether, that if you sign up for the provincial party, you're signing up for the federal party as well. That would hold back, I would say, a lot of federal Liberals, perhaps, from signing on completely. When it comes to the voters themselves, I think it depends on how. There's sort of a maxim in Alberta politics that if it's about the three issues kind of rotate, it's the economy, healthcare, and education. And if you can, when it comes to the economy and the question of the economy, the Conservatives or conservative-leaning party in this province will win 10 out of 10 times, I believe, because they're just seen as being better stewards of the economy. When it comes to healthcare and education, there's a little bit of grappling that could happen there. I think the New Democrats won in 2016 based on kind of none of these. I think that they won based on general fatigue with the historic Conservative Party, the Progressive Conservatives here. I think that if I look at the sort of provincial makeup in this province, I think the UCP has done a really good job of staying hyper-focused on that economy question. They've also taken on key healthcare questions that pull well across both progressive and conservative voters, like on the issue of addictions and mental health. If you had looked at a poll of what you should do about it, both conservative and progressive voters sort of come in at the same place. So they've picked the issues on healthcare and education that sit well with both types of voters. And that is, I think, undermining the New Democrats game, like war game in the province right now. I still think that there is a place for that centrist party, but in Western Canada right now, you are not seeing any third party alternative with any kind of strength right now. And so I think if I'm the Alberta New Democrats, I'm looking at Avi Lewis and I'm looking at what the UCP is doing. I'm also looking at a rebrand, because I don't think that I find my way back to the Premier's office unless I am able to both separate myself from the federal New Democrats and also establish myself as a viable authority on the economy outside of the UCP.
And before we go to our last topic, I do want Brian to know that I don't think Mark Carney had any decision-making power with the Edmonton Oilers to not replace a porous D, not get a decent goalie. I'm just like, I don't want to defend the man, but...
Seems like, Marco, how do you know he didn't ruin our goalie's confidence by scoring a goal on him? Like,
It's true. That is true. But, the Mark Carney made it look easy, and the Panthers followed suit.
Listen, the Carney curse, I like it. All right? You've branded things. I'm going with this, all right?
Fair or not. Let's talk about our last topic, Senate reform, which always will excite some Albertans, I have no doubt. That being said, it's actually, if anything, going kind of backwards a bit. So we've been hearing some discussions about the Liberals potentially wanting to take a more hands-on approach to dealing with the Senate. There was a rumor that Mark Carney was going to appoint a new leader of the government in the Senate, have that person sit in cabinet. That would be Tom Pitfield, a senior PMO advisor. That has not come to pass. We don't know if Mark Carney didn't necessarily reject it or dismiss the idea. We reported last week there's talks on their way for a potential new group in the Senate. It's unclear if that's connected to maybe a push to create a government Senate caucus, or it's just about the implosion of the ISG. A lot of moving parts in the Senate, but I guess, I'll just try to keep things brief. Brian, is any of this needed? Like, is the Senate really slowing down the government's agenda? Like, what's the point of reimagining or unwinding these Trudeau reforms to the Senate at this time?
Well, I have to admit, I don't spend a lot of time in my regular day thinking about the Senate and Senate reforms since, I mean, when I was in government, I was very frustrated with the Senate and felt like there was better ways to deal with the Senate. I, though, digging into it and talking to some sources, talking to some Senate staffers, some senators on how the Senate has actually been working, I kind of think this is one of the things that actually has been working, having a more independent Senate, especially in a situation where if you get a majority government or you have opposition parties that are reeling because of bad polling, it's the Senate that is actually the more independent nature of the Senate's actually stepped up to put a bit of a sober second thought on some of the legislation in the last year. There's been a couple of examples of it, Marco, that we've talked about on the background, but there's never ever been a PMO in the last 40 years that I know of that doesn't want more control. And I think what's the point of having, I think from the Carney perspective, what's the point of having a majority government if you still have to negotiate with senators to get things through? And so it does appear like the government's trying to go back to the old days of having more control in the Senate. I don't think it's a good thing for the country. I think we need a chamber of sober second thought. Otherwise, what's the point in having it?
I will agree to disagree with Brian. He's absolutely right, of course. But if you're looking at a prime minister's office that is looking to flex its governance and organizational prowess and has also been very smart about consolidating power, I think that the Senate, especially the independent senators group, is something that's sort of ripe for a little bit of change here. And you need a unique group of people who will help see the big picture and get your agenda through the Senate. I do agree that they've been good at raising issues. They've been thoughtful, especially the newer appointed senators. But I also think it has posed a little bit of a risk to the government's agenda at times. And so I can see why a government that's keen on seeing really big moves and transformations in Canada is looking to roll back some of those reforms or take it back to another era. Of course, that brings us back to the point I think Brian made it as well, that it's another sort of rollback of a Trudeau era reform. And so people who were brought into the party on some of those electoral or governance reforms, just as the people that they brought in on the climate issues may find themselves without a home all of a sudden or frustrated. And I think that also represents a vulnerability to the long-term governance of the Liberals.
I think it could lead. This is an overstep that I think might end up biting the Liberals, because this is not caucus. It's not caucus that's reliant on the goodwill of the Prime Minister for an appointment, for their nomination, for all sorts of things. These are people that were appointed under the auspice that they were going to be independent senators and give a sober second thought to things. You would hope that there's enough faith in our institutions that these people aren't going to just give up that independence and power that they currently have so that they can get an extra $10,000 stipend for some position in the Senate that's not the equivalent of positions in the House of Commons.
Interesting stuff. We'll have to see what comes of it, if anything, or if it's just some Ottawa gossip and rumor mill churning. But of course, we'll have you all covered.
It was a great article by Marco Vigliotti that broke this story. Thanks. I will actually give you kudos.
That upstart, yeah, definitely. Heard he's a really handsome guy too, so appreciate that.
Let's not go overboard.
Okay, sorry. A bit of artistic license there. Before we sign off, I'd like everyone to kind of talk about something they're looking forward to in the week ahead, or something that maybe caught their eye that didn't get any attention in the past week. I'll start with you, Sarah.
So I'm looking forward to see what comes out of this convention in the Liberal convention in Montreal, aside from, bagel taste testing. But something that caught my eye yesterday in the Globe and Mail was something I think that we need to watch is happiness amongst young people is down. That's down in Canada. And I think it's worth watching because a key point that was made, and this is someone out of Vancouver who's looking at a sort of metabolizing this global happiness index, I believe, is that government has not matched the spending that it has currently on baby boomers with new revenue generation, and it has left little to invest in the next generation. And I think that it is worth watching because I think this is a question that will come to a head in the next 5 to 7 years in this country. And I think it risks reshaping a lot of our social institutions and our government institutions. So keep an eye on that, and Fairmont versus St. Viateur is the age-old question in Montreal.
We should do some polling on that.
Well, personally, when I used to go to conservative conventions, it was always more of the Holiday Inn kind of guy. But I would say that I'm going to steal a little bit of Marco's ability to do two. Just an FYI, I'm hearing that as I've talked about Minister Calandra's legislation, I think it's going to get tabled next week. I think it's going to be interesting, potentially the most disruptive legislation that the Ford government's going to put forward this session. So I'm keeping an eye out on that. But like by-elections and floor crossers, that's the name of the game for the next week here in Ottawa. Going to have a close eye on both. I'm happy to say that our iPolitics team is going to be in both locations, or all three locations, for the by-elections. It's going to be an interesting evening. And then, as we talked about earlier, 172 is not enough. Is there floor crossers to go along with that? And where will the floor crossers come from? Is Avi Lewis going to take his first hit? Is it going to be an NDP floor crosser? Or is it going to be more conservative floor crossers? Or will there be no floor crossers? So this is going to be, I think, the really interesting question for the next week to 10 days here in Ottawa.
No, that's a good thing to flag. Yes. And we're going to be at the convention in Montreal, and then we'll also have reporters in Terrebonne and in Toronto for those very three important by-elections. One thing I wanted to flag was Doug Ford's comment to the Toronto Star that he was basically gunning for a Liberal majority in these by-elections. I think it's telling because I do wonder if it provides a bit of insight into the Ford brain trust in that they've seen recent polling showing their numbers take a bit of a hit and the Liberals way up. And I do wonder if they are putting the pieces together thinking, look, the Ontario Liberals don't have a leader right now. Is this just people making that association that Liberal means Mark Carney, even if, they generally like Doug Ford, they just see Mark Carney as being more personally popular, or is it trying to be an attempt to kind of continue to dragging on this guy's coattails when it comes to that popularity wave? Have they, seen something we haven't? Because it does seem that there is a significant, weakening in that Ford coalition. At least some initial polls are showing that, and that approval rating for the premier are way, way, way down. So I do wonder if it's an attempt for him to either try to stop some of that bloodletting by saying, look, me and Mark Carney are on the same page here, or if it is him trying to get ahead of a potential Liberal resurgence by saying, look, Mark Carney is the different person than the provincial Liberals who don't have a leader right now and won't have one for the next few months. So I'm very curious to see what the Ontario polling looks like and how Doug Ford kind of tries to toe that line between still being a progressive conservative premier, but also seemingly being Mark Carney's best friend. So very curious to see what happens there. But yeah, that brings us to the end of our podcast. Sarah and Brian, thank you for joining me. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll have a new episode next week where we will break down not only the Liberal convention, but those three very, very big by-elections. And just one final plug, on April 13th, as you watch the results come in, please join iPolitics. We'll have a live blog running the entire night, which should be an interesting event. So thank you, everyone. See you next week.